All right, diving in today, and we're going deep on this one. It's associationism, something that's been a big deal in philosophy, psychology, you name it, for, well, really long time.
Yeah, going way back. And it's been a central idea for folks trying to figure out how learning, actually shapes how we think. From, those early empiricists in Britain all the way to the connectionists we see today.
So we're talking about a pretty big chunk of intellectual history here.
Oh, absolutely. And, what makes this really fascinating, especially from a, philosophical standpoint, is that associationism, it's not like this nice, neat theory all wrapped up in a bow.
Right. Not a simple equation we can just plug in.
Yeah, exactly. It's more like a whole bunch of related ideas kind of circling around this core concept. You might call it the irrationality of thought.
Irrationality. Okay, that's a new one. Break that down for me a bit.
Sure. So the basic idea is that our thoughts, our mental states, they don't just exist in isolation. They get linked together. And the way they get linked is through our experiences, through how we interact with the world, cause and effect and all that.
So our experiences are literally shaping the connections between our thoughts.
Yeah.
Like how we understand the world is being built based on what we encounter.
Exactly. And then the really interesting part is when one of these thoughts, these linked thoughts, gets activated, it kind of brings its buddies along with it.
Like a chain reaction in the mind.
Yeah, kind of like that. It's like, think of a common pairing, peanut butter and jelly. You think of one, you almost automatically think of the other.
Okay, so just to be clear, we're not just looking at one single concept here. We've got sources here talking about associationism as a theory of learning. How do we pick up new concepts, new behaviors? Then there's thinking, how do our thoughts actually flow, one leading to the next? And then mental structures. This is where those classic pairings come in, cause and effect, things we always see together. And finally, there's the question of how is thought actually happening in the brain? And that leads us to, connectionism.
You got it. You laid it all out. And it's important to keep in mind that these different applications, learning, thinking, structure, implementation, they're distinct. You could buy into an associationist explanation for learning without necessarily buying into, let's say, how those associations are represented in the mind.
Right. So these pieces, they fit together, but they're not inseparable.
Exactly. But the common thread running through all of this, it's this deep commitment to empiricism, this idea that experience is the wellspring of our mental content. What we see, what we do, shapes who we are, how we think.
Now, there's this term, this pure associationist, that keeps popping up. It sounds like somebody who just takes associationism and applies it to everything. Learning, thinking, mental structure, the whole 9 yards.
Mm-hmm.
Is that a real thing, though?
Yeah.
Are there people out there who are pure associationists?
That's a good question and a sharp one, especially coming from a philosopher. The pure associationist, it's more like a theoretical ideal, a benchmark, you might say.
Okay, so like a perfect specimen in a textbook, not something you find out in the wild.
Right. You rarely find someone who perfectly embodies that across the board. But there have been plenty of thinkers who've leaned heavily in that direction. Think of Locke and Hume, those giants of British empiricism, or the behaviorists folks like Thorndike and Skinner, and even, some branches of modern connectionism.
Right. They all put a lot of stock in the power of association to shake the mind.
Exactly. They each have their own spin on it, of course, but that core idea is there.
And it's interesting how these other ideas kind of tag along with associationism.
Yeah.
You've got empiricism itself, obviously, and then behaviorism, where the focus is on those actions we can observe, sometimes even a bit of skepticism towards internal mental representations.
Mm-hmm.
And then the idea that learning, most of the time, it's gradual, step by step. And this notion of domain general learning, where the learning mechanisms are basically the same no matter what you're learning. But you pointed out earlier, these aren't all glued together.
Yeah, you don't have to subscribe to the whole package deal. You could be, say, an empiricist without being a hardcore associationist. You might believe that knowledge comes from experience, but not that association is the only way we process that experience.
So you're saying you could believe in the raw materials coming from experience, but maybe not in the specific tools used to shape them.
Exactly. It's about recognizing those subtle distinctions.
So for this deep dive, our mission for you, our listener, is to really get into the guts of associationism. We're going to break it down piece by piece, see how it all fits, and, take a look at where it might not hold up, where the critics come in. So first up, let's tackle associationism as a theory of mental processes. And this is where the connection to empiricism really comes into play.
All right, excellent starting point. So empiricism at its core, it's about explaining everything in our minds through learning. Those thinkers in this tradition, they've been obsessed with how we get concepts, ideas, responses, whatever you want to call them, through our interactions with the world, through what we sense.
Right, so it's all about how experience shapes those mental building blocks.
And that's where associationism first comes in. Thinkers like Hume, they proposed it as this fundamental mental operation, this core ability we have to associate ideas that initially came from those sensory impressions, from what we see, hear, touch, and so on.
So if you're building a theory of mind from scratch, starting with just one basic process association that seems pretty elegant.
Oh, it is. It's very parsimonious.
But we do a lot of stuff with our minds, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we learn, we think, we reason, we imagine. So if association is supposed to be the bedrock, the engine driving all of that, it has to be incredibly versatile, right?
Mm-hmm.
It can't just be a one-trick pony.
You're absolutely right. It's got to be flexible. It's got to be powerful. It needs to explain how we acquire new information and then how we think about it, how we reason with it, how we use it. And that's why associationism, it's been applied to both learning and thinking, often using those same basic principles.
Okay, so let's dive into the learning side first. How does associationism explain how we actually acquire new knowledge, new skills?
So when we talk about associationism as a theory of learning, we're talking about how any organism, humans, animals, you name it, acquire concepts, build those mental connections, even develop biases in how they respond to things, and potentially even gain knowledge that can be expressed as, propositions of statements about the world. And it all comes down to experience, to what we encounter in the world.
Right. So learning isn't just about passively absorbing information. It's about actively building these connections based on what we experience.
Exactly. And the sources here, they point us back to John Locke as one of the early figures in associationism, although, his contributions were kind of brief. But then it was Hume who really took the ball and ran with it, especially in his treatise of human nature. He was obsessed with how those direct sensory experiences, he called them impressions, shape the way our thoughts flow, what he called ideas.
Right, those classic Humean terms, impressions and ideas.
Mm-hmm.
I remember his famous copy principle, the idea that all those ideas in our minds are ultimately copies of some sensory experience we had before.
Exactly. And Hume believed those principles of association, they were the rules of the game. They determined how those copied ideas interact with each other. So let's say you experience two impressions together consistently, like, the feeling of warmth and seeing the sun. Hume would say those corresponding ideas of warmth and sun, they'd get linked in your mind.
So the structure of our ideas, how they connect, it mirrors the structure of those initial impressions.
Precisely. That's a beautiful way to put it.
And Hume, he had those famous three types of associative relations: cause and effect, contiguity, basically things happening close together in time or space, and resemblance.
Right, things that look or feel similar.
So if two impressions are related in one of those ways, the ideas, they become mentally paired up, right? Can you give us an example just to make it crystal clear?
Sure. Imagine, you're out in the woods and you keep hearing this distinctive bird song. And each time you hear it, you also see this bird with a bright red head. So you've got contiguity happening there, the song and the bird appearing together. Over time, the idea of that song, it might become so strongly associated with the idea of that red-headed bird that just hearing the song, bam, brings the image of the bird to mind, even if you can't see it at that moment.
Okay, I see. So the song becomes like a mental trigger for the bird because they've been experienced together so often.
Exactly. And this brings us to a more general principle of associative learning. If you experience two things, let's call them X and Y, and they're connected by some relationship, some associative relation R, which, for Hume, was cause and effect, contiguity, or resemblance, then X and Y, they get associated. So in the future, when X pops up, it'll tend to trigger Y.
But, the sources do point out that this relationship, this R, what exactly makes something a relevant associative link? That's been debated.
Absolutely. Hume's categories, they were hugely influential, but later thinkers, they've proposed their own refinements and additions to what counts as an associative link. The core idea, though, it's still there. Learning at its heart, it's about creating these connections between mental contents based on how we experience them in the world.
Right, so those connections aren't arbitrary. They're based on real patterns in our experience.
Exactly. And this leads us nicely to, Pavlov and his groundbreaking work on classical conditioning. This is where we get, the classic example, the dog, the bell, and the drool.
Right, the one everyone remembers from Psych 101.
Exactly. Pavlov, he came up with this incredibly elegant experiment, a way to study how animals learn new associations between stimuli. He started with what he called an unconditioned stimulus, something that just naturally triggers a response, no learning needed.
Like a reflex.
Right. In his famous experiments, it was the meat powder, which naturally made the dog salivate the unconditioned response.
And then he brought in that neutral stimulus, like the bell, right before the meat powder. What happened when he kept doing that, pairing those two?
The key was repetition. After pairing the bell and the meat powder over and over, the dog started salivating at the sound of the bell alone, even before the meat powder showed up.
So the bell became a stand-in for the food, like a learned trigger.
You got it. At that point, the bell, it's no longer neutral, it's become a conditioned stimulus, and that salivating in response to the bell, that's the conditioned response. So what we see here is the dog learning a brand new association between that bell, which used to mean nothing special, and that salivation response.
The sources, they call this stimulus substitution. What does that mean exactly?
It means one stimulus, the bell, it essentially becomes a substitute for the other, the meat powder, in its ability to trigger that response. The response itself, it doesn't really change. It's just what sets it off that's different.
So it's like the bell is now carrying the meaning of the food as far as the dog's brain is concerned.
Precisely. However, some researchers felt that classical conditioning, while super important, might be a little too limited. Like, can it really explain the whole range of behaviors we see, especially those more complex voluntary actions?
Right, like it explains reflexes, but what about those things we do intentionally with a goal in mind?
And that brings us to Thorndike and his puzzle boxes. This is where operant conditioning comes in. He expanded the idea of associative learning, bringing in the role of consequences. What happens after a behavior? This moves us beyond reflexes and into the realm of learning new actions based on the outcomes they produce.
Okay, so not just reacting to stimuli, but acting and then learning from what happens next.
Right. Thorndike, he put cats in these puzzle boxes and they had to figure out how to escape. Pull a lever, press a button, something like that.
And these weren't instinctual behaviors for the cats, right? They had to learn them.
Exactly. And he noticed something really interesting. If a certain action, like pulling that lever, consistently led to a good outcome, like, escaping the box, the cat was more likely to repeat that action the next time it was in the box.
Makes sense. Do it once, get rewarded, do it again.
Exactly. And this observation, it led to his famous law of effect. It's basically saying behaviors followed by something good, something satisfying, they get strengthened, they get associated with that situation. And behaviors that lead to something bad, well, they're less likely to be repeated.
So pleasure strengthens the connection and discomfort weakens it.
You got it. Thorndike also came up with the law of exercise, which basically says the more times you pair a situation and a response, the stronger that connection gets.
So repetition matters too. Practice makes perfect, kind of.
Yeah, in a way. And then Skinner, he came along and really built on this, focusing on the idea of reinforcement. This is how those connections between behaviors and consequences are created and strengthened.
So reinforcement is basically anything that makes a behavior more likely to happen again.
Exactly. And while Thorndike and Skinner, they had their own little differences in their theories, the core idea is the same. Associative learning, it's driven by the relationship between our actions and what happens afterwards.
Okay, so the consequences are key. Now, the sources bring up a philosophical point here that's pretty important. They say associative learning, ideally it should reflect the actual patterns in the world, right? Without imposing a ton of pre-existing structure, stuff we're just born with. And this connects to the idea of domain general learning, this idea that associative learning, it's this kind of universal mechanism. It can form connections between any types of content. And there's that famous Pavlov quote where he says, any natural phenomenon could become a conditioned stimulus.
Yeah, that quote's a classic. And it really captures the essence of domain general learning. It doesn't matter if it's something you see, hear, smell, whatever. If it consistently occurs with something else, boom, association.
So we're not limited to specific types of information. We can learn associations between pretty much anything.
Right, and this idea was super appealing to the empiricists, those folks who wanted to minimize the role of, innate knowledge. If learning is all about detecting and encoding associations between whatever happens to occur together in our experience, well, then you don't need to assume we're born with all these specialized learning modules in our brains.
Okay, so we've covered how associations are learned. Now let's talk about how they're actually stored in the mind. That brings us to the idea of associative structures.
Right, so we learn that X and Y are associated, but how is that information actually represented in our minds? One possibility is we have these explicit, rule-like representations, but, associationists, they've tended to prefer a more direct approach. The information is stored as an associative structure, a bond, a link, connecting those two mental states. Think of, a classic pairing, salt and pepper.
Salt and pepper, the ultimate dynamic duo.
Right. They just go together. And for an associationist, that going together is represented in the mind by a direct link between those concepts.
So the associative structure is the connection itself. And the sources emphasize that these structures are defined functionally. What does that mean exactly?
It means that, well, if X and Y form an associative structure, activating X will directly lead to activating Y and vice versa. No need for any extra steps in between, no mental gymnastics. It's just this basic causal relationship.
So if I say salt, your mind automatically jumps to pepper because of that direct link, that structure.
Exactly. And this is different from, say, propositional structures. These involve a different kind of organization. The example they give is the associative structure green toucan versus the propositional thought, there is a green toucan.
So one is just a pairing, and the other is making a statement about the world.
Exactly. The key difference is structure and the type of relationship. Green toucan is a strong link. Activating one makes you think of the other. But there's no inherent statement being made. A propositional thought like, there is a green toucan, it's making a claim. It's saying a toucan has the property of being green.
Right. So the proposition is more complex. It has internal parts and relationships. It's not just two things next to each other.
Exactly. And this difference is crucial for understanding how we get from simple associations to, complex structured thoughts.
Right. From basic pairings to the kind of thinking we do when we reason and form beliefs. Now, the sources, they point out that associative structures, they're not just for simple concepts. You can have associations between whole propositions or even between a concept and an emotion, what they call valences.
Yeah, like if you associate the idea of spiders with the feeling of fear.
Exactly. And they also say not all semantically related concepts are directly associated. Like doctor and nurse, they might be linked for a lot of people, but horse and zebra, maybe not so much.
Right. It depends on your experiences, on what you've encountered, and how those things have been paired in your mind.
And these different types of mental structures, associative versus others, they could behave differently in our minds.
Yeah.
Like some might be more resistant to forgetting or to damage from, things like dementia.
Absolutely. The way they're structured has a big impact on how they function and how they hold up over time.
Now let's talk about associative symmetry. Ideally, if, say, salt and pepper are associated, that link should work equally well in both directions.
Right, it should be a two-way street.
But the sources, they say in reality, this perfect symmetry, it's often broken. Why is that?
Well, several reasons. One is the order we learn things in. If you constantly encounter salt, then pepper, that pathway, it might get more ingrained than the reverse. Also, the number of connections each element has matters. Like green, it's probably associated with a ton of other concepts, grass, trees, envy, whatever. But toucan, maybe its main associate is green. So activating toucan is going to lead to green much faster than green will lead to toucan.
Because green has so many other potential paths to go down.
Exactly. It's like a busy intersection versus a quiet side street.
Makes sense. And then there's this idea of activation maps of associative structure. The psychologists, they actually try to map out these networks in people's minds, right? To see what's connected to what. They use things like lexical decision tasks, where you have to decide if a string of letters is a real word or not, and priming studies, where they flash you a word real quick before showing you another one. And these maps, they aim to show not just what concepts are linked, but how strong those links are, and if the activation flows both ways equally.
Exactly. It's like trying to draw a map of a city, but instead of streets, you're mapping connections between concepts and seeing where the traffic flows smoothly and where there are, bottlenecks or detours.
Okay, now let's bring it back to learning. How do those learning processes actually lead to the formation of those structures we've been talking about?
Mm-hmm.
The sources mention this term, bare-boned association.
Right. Bare-boned association is this idea that the link between learning and structure is super direct. The strength of the connection between X and Y, it's purely determined by how often they've been paired together in your experience.
So the more you see salt and pepper together, the stronger that mental bond becomes. Makes sense.
It's a very simple, elegant view. But of course, there might be other ways that learning could shape mental structure. It might not always be this one-to-one mapping.
So you're saying associative learning could potentially lead to other types of mental representation besides associative structures.
Right, like maybe propositional ones. For example, you repeatedly experience the smell of smoke followed by seeing a fire. This could lead to that associative structure between smoke and fire, but it could also lead you to form a more explicit belief, like, if I smell smoke, then there's probably a fire nearby.
So same experiences, different ways of representing the knowledge. One's a simple link, the other's a full-blown if-then statement.
Exactly, and those different representations, they'll have their own unique properties and implications for how we think and act.
Now, how do we get rid of or change existing associations? The sources mention extinction and counterconditioning as the main ways to do this.
Yeah, those are the classic techniques. Extinction, it's basically presenting the conditioned stimulus, the bell, in Pavlov's experiment without the unconditioned stimulus, the meat powder. And you do this repeatedly. Over time, the bell stops triggering the salivation response.
So you break the association by decoupling the two things.
Exactly. And counterconditioning, it's specifically for when you have a representation linked to a feeling of valence, like that spider sphere association. Counterconditioning would involve pairing spiders with something that evokes a good feeling, like, I don't know, maybe pictures of puppies. The idea is to overwrite the original association with a new opposing one.
So it's a bit like exposure therapy, where they gradually expose you to the thing you're afraid of in a safe environment.
Yeah, it's got some similarities, but, these processes, they're not always as straightforward as they seem. There's debate about how exactly they work, how effective they are.
Like, does extinction really erase the original association completely? Or is it more like suppressing it, hiding it under a new layer of learning?
Right. And then there's the phenomenon of spontaneous recovery, where an extinguished response can suddenly reappear after a while. It's all more complicated than we initially thought.
But there's a really important point here, especially for the philosophers listening in. Locke pointed this out. These associative structures, they're not easily changed just by reasoning or acquiring new facts.
Yeah, you can't just think your way out of an association.
So you might know perfectly well that a certain food didn't actually make you sick, but you might still feel averse to it.
Exactly. Our gut reactions, our learned associations, they often operate on a different level than our conscious, rational thoughts. You can have all the evidence in the world, but that doesn't always break those deep-seated associations.
They have a kind of stubborn persistence.
They do. And it really highlights this idea that associative structures, they're primarily changed through those learning mechanisms, those extinction and counter-conditioning processes, rather than through, logic and reason.
So changing our feelings isn't always as easy as changing our minds. Now, we've seen how associations are learned, how they're structured, but what about thinking itself? How do those associations actually shape the flow of our thoughts?
Right. And that brings us to associative transitions, which is kind of similar to what William James called the stream of thought.
Like how our thoughts kind of flow from one to the next, like a stream, not always in a logical order.
Exactly. Associative transitions, they're about how our thoughts connect, not because of logic or inference, but because of those learned associations.
So it's not like following a chain of reasoning where each thought leads logically to the next. It's more like one thought triggers another because they happen to be linked in your mind, even if there's no logical connection.
Right. Like you might be thinking about the coffee's cold, and suddenly your mind jumps to, I need to buy new shoes. Those thoughts, they're not logically connected, but maybe they're linked in your mind because, I don't know, you were wearing those shoes the last time you had cold coffee.
Right, so it's those personal, idiosyncratic connections that drive associative transitions. And this leads to a kind of interesting paradox. The sources talk about associative inference, which sounds kind of contradictory. How can an inference, which we think of as a rational process, be associative?
It's a good point. The idea behind associative inference is that some thought connections, they might start as genuine logical inferences. But if you use them often enough, the premises and the conclusion, they get so tightly linked that the transition becomes automatic. You don't need to consciously reason through it anymore.
So, like, you might start by consciously going through the steps of an argument, but eventually, just hearing the premises, bam, the conclusion pops into your head.
Right. It's like that inferential pathway becomes a well-worn groove in your mind.
And this distinction between associative and inferential transitions, it shows up in research too, right? Associative transitions, they're more likely to jump between totally different topics and can even affect our mood.
Yeah, that's right. Associative thinking, it's more fluid, less constrained by logic. It can lead to those unexpected connections between seemingly unrelated ideas. And some studies even suggest that this type of thinking is linked to positive mood changes, maybe because it allows for more creativity, more exploration of possibilities.
Okay, so we've seen how associations shape thinking. Now let's get down to the nitty-gritty. How are these associations actually implemented in the brain? This is where we get into associative instantiation and those connectionist networks.
Right. Connectionist networks, they're a prime example of how associationism can be implemented at a more fundamental level. These networks, they're made up of these interconnected nodes, kind of like a network of roads, but for information.
And those connections, they have different strengths, right? What they call weights.
Exactly. And those weights, they essentially represent those associative strengths. The
Right.
stronger the association, the higher the weight.
So these networks have input nodes, which are like the entry points for information, and output nodes, which give you the results. And often there are these hidden nodes in between doing their mysterious processing. And the whole network, the connections and the weights, they create a kind of map of the associations in the system.
Right. It's like a web of interconnected concepts and ideas.
And the sources point out that these networks, they seem to be purely associative. They operate on a level below symbols, below those discrete representations of things.
Yeah, they're subsymbolic. It's not like each node represents a specific word or concept. It's more about patterns of activation across the whole network.
So it's not like a dictionary where each word has a specific entry. It's more like the meaning is spread out, distributed across the network.
Exactly. And while these networks are, fundamentally associative, they can actually be pretty powerful. They can, in theory, implement any computation that a regular computer can do.
So even though they're based on these simple associations, they can do complex stuff.
Right. And this has led some folks, those who believe in the computational theory of mind, to suggest that maybe the brain itself is fundamentally an associative network, but one that's capable of, carrying out complex computations.
So a lot of those complex mental processes, maybe they're actually built on these simple associative mechanisms. But there's a philosophical question here, right? Even if the structure of the network is associative, does that mean those patterns of activation, are they actually mental representations? Do they carry meaning in a way we'd normally think about it?
That's a great point, and that's a whole other debate. Some connectionists, they lean towards anti-representationalism. They say, no, it's just patterns, no real meaning there. Others say, no, those patterns do represent something. They're just distributed, spread out across the network.
So even within connectionism, there are those deeper philosophical questions about the nature of representation.
Exactly. It's always more complicated than it seems on the surface.
Okay, so we've gone through the different varieties of associationism. How do they relate to each other, and how do they connect to those other philosophical and psychological ideas we talked about earlier? Empiricism, behaviorism, all that.
Right. So the four aspects we've discussed, learning, structure, transitions, instantiation, they're all conceptually distinct, even though they often show up together thanks to that shared empiricist heritage.
So you could have someone who buys into associative learning, but maybe has a different view on how those associations are stored or how they influence thinking.
Exactly. And the sources, they give some nice examples of this. We've got empiricists who aren't strict associationists, and even some nativists who incorporate associative mechanisms into their theories. It's a reminder that these categories, they're not airtight compartments.
Right, they can mix and match in interesting ways.
And you don't have to be a behaviorist to be an associationist either. And then there's that whole debate about representationalism versus anti-representationalism, which, cuts across those categories. And some theorists, like Rescorla and Hayes, they've even argued that learning can be super fast, even one-shot, within an associationist framework.
So challenging that traditional idea of slow, gradual association formation.
Exactly. It's a reminder that associationism, it's not a monolithic thing. It's a family of ideas with lots of variations and nuances.
So a rich history, diverse applications, internal debates, it's all there. Now let's zoom in on the present. What's the status of associationism in current psychological research? The sources say it's maybe taken a bit of a back seat in cognitive psychology and psycholinguistics since the cognitive revolution, but it's seen a comeback in social psychology, especially in the study of implicit attitudes and those dual process theories.
Yeah, it's interesting how it's kind of shifted its territory. While a lot of cognitive psychology moved towards those more rule-based computational models, associationism found a home in social psychology, which is kind of funny considering social psychology is all about, context and social influences. You wouldn't necessarily think it'd be a hotbed for associationism, but here we are.
So let's talk about implicit attitudes. They're often measured using those indirect tests like the IET, the implicit association test, and they're contrasted with our explicit attitudes. Those are the ones we can consciously report. What's the mainstream view in social psychology on those implicit attitudes through an associationist lens?
The dominant view is that implicit attitudes are, at their core, associations, links between mental representations, or, more specifically, between social categories and positive or negative evaluations, what we call valences.
So, like, you might have a negative association with a certain social group, even if you consciously believe you don't.